Good afternoon, everyone. House Tax will come to order. The first item of business would be requests for bill introductions. Do we have any requests today? Seeing none, we will move on to our first item of business, and that is an informational hearing on Senate Bill 8. Just a refresher, committee, Senate Bill 8 is officially dead. That's why it's not a regular hearing. But there are several provisions out of Senate Bill 8 that we're going to be pulling out individually to talk about and discuss. And today we'll be dealing with the personal property tax provisions. And I'll turn to the reviser to kind of give an overview on what we are discussing today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you stated, Senate Bill 2023, Senate Bill number 8, sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 provide changes to personal property tax filings and decreasing certain penalties for failing to file certain tax statements. Under section 4 of the bill, which is KSA 79-306, it would provide that a person would only be required to file an initial statement listing tangible personal property with the county appraiser, and would not be required to file an annual subsequent annual statement. Essentially, they have to only file it one time, unless there be a change to report relating to the property that would be listed on the statement. Then Section 5, Section 6, and Section 7 of Senate Bill 8 would decrease certain penalties, which would include the failing to file a statement of assessment for oil and gas leases, the statement listing property for assessment and taxation purposes. These penalties would be decreased from what is currently 5% to 2% for the late filing, and the additional monthly penalty of 5% is lowered to 2%. Lastly, the aggregate penalty maximum of 25% is decreased to 10%, and the penalty for failing to make and file a statement listing property for tax and the penalty for omitted personal property is decreased from what is 50% to 12.5%. And then lastly, a provision of Senate Bill 8 was an appraiser would be granted the authority to extend for a reasonable time in which to file a statement if such request is made. This includes a change in classification of machinery and equipment used in grain storage and biofuel processing industry that had been previously classified as real property or fixtures. The State Board of Tax Appeals and the county appraiser are authorized to abate penalties for failure or make and file tax statements for such property. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. And committee, if some of this sounds familiar, and I didn't do the research, I don't know if you did or not, but we did have some House bills last year that contained some of these provisions. I failed to look those up to provide those to the committee. Did you have those handy by chance?
I believe the provisions were in Senate Bill 8. The underlying provisions were in 8.
Okay, as it came through?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Committee, are there any further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Adam. Our first testimony, we had written testimony from Martha Smith. We'd like to welcome to. Yeah, we'll go ahead and Kathleen, do you want to come up? The fiscal note it's pretty much the same as it was. Kathleen, did you want to address that right quick?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. The impact to the state levies is increased just a tad based upon the personal property penalties have increased from tax year 2022 to 2023. So our original fiscal note had an impact to the state levies of around $394,000, and it has now increased to around $421,000. That would be $391,000 to the State School Finance Fund, $19,571 to the State Institutions of a Higher Learning Fund, and then the $97.85 to the other building fund.
Thank you, Representative Sanders. Did you have a question?
I do. So, Kathleen, thanks for being here and thanks for being in your regular seat. So my understanding from the reviser was that the penalties are going down Why would the fiscal note be going up?
Because the penalties were going down in the original bill, and that's what we estimated on. It was like a 65% decrease, an average of 65% decrease. However, the personal property penalties assessed at the county level have increased in tax year 2023. So we redid our estimate based upon those new personal property penalties. So it has gone up just a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Seeing no further questions, thank you for that, Kathleen. And now, committee, we will welcome Randy Stuckey for proponent testimony. I don't think your mic is on.
Terrific. Thank you
There
very
you
much.
go.
Oh, that's a lot different. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the time today. Randy Stuckey this afternoon on behalf of the Kansas Grain and Feed Association. That's the grain elevators in the state of Kansas. And Reno Kansas Biofuels Association, the 12 ethanol and biodiesel facilities in the state of Kansas. We did stand in support of Senate Bill 8, and it was 8 proper as it passed out of the Senate Tax Committee and then across unanimously, and then across the floor out of this committee and across the House floor with only 2 no votes. So it was a very popular bill as it passed the Senate and the House. It was popular, I think, in part because it was a very simple bill, and I think we did a good job of explaining why it was important for us. Here we had basically 2 worlds colliding. The world that you just heard explained of the current law, which if you own taxable personal property in the state of Kansas, you're required to file an annual property rendition or list of what you own that's taxable. For our purposes, for the grain elevators and the ethanol plants, we're not talking about boats and trailers and ATVs. We're talking about machinery and equipment, which is extensive at a complex facility like a grain elevator. And failure to file timely is a small penalty it's a percentage of the tax owed. The longer you wait to file, the larger that penalty gets. And if you don't file over a year, that's a 50%, currently in the law, a 50% penalty on the amount of tax owed. Now, that's punitive by any definition. And so some people, I suppose, end up paying that. We ended up paying it for the other thing that we talked about last year, and it's this short story. In the grain elevator industry and the Reno Kansas biofuels facility industry, we have for many years disagreed with PVD and the county appraisers on how to properly classify that machinery and equipment. And it matters to a great deal because it's taxable if it's a fixture to the property. And if it's not a fixture to the property, if it's personal property, then it's classified as such, then it's exempt from taxation for property tax in the state of Kansas. This isn't just our industry, this is all industries that have machinery and equipment. That law was passed in 2006, it still exists. What happened in 2002 then, after a long time of disagreement and lawsuit that was filed in the county district court, was appealed to the Court of Appeals, and finally in 2022, in the summer of 2022, the Court of Appeals said the grain industry's machinery and equipment should be properly classified as personal property, not as fixtures to the realty. And then it wasn't until November or October or November of that year that the Kansas Supreme Court said, we aren't going to accept the request for review. We're going to let the Court of Appeals decision stand. So now we have clear law in the state of Kansas about how to properly classify the assets of the grain industry and arguably, we would say, the ethanol industry. Well, if the deadline to file the rendition is March 15th, and the decision to whether of the Kansas Supreme Court's decision came out in November, clearly they would not have had time to remedy that filing in February or March of that year. Here comes the 50% tax penalty right at us. And we were told that if they wanted to appeal and properly classify that classification for that tax year, look out, because this 50% tax penalty is going to be staring in the face. Essentially, that's what we were told. That's what we told our members. And so we came to the legislature in 2023, last year, And we did not introduce Senate Bill 8, but thankfully somebody did for a different reason. And we said, hey, this is specifically and directly our issue. And so we tacked on to Senate Bill 8 and said, hey, this makes sense. We think that the 50%, and just in general, the 50% tax penalty is onerous and probably should be decreased. But for our purposes, and this was the amendment language that came in through the Senate, was just gone over, is in our case, we put language in the bill that says, if your property was previously classified as real property and now has been classified as personal property, that should be good cause for the county appraiser to be able to waive that penalty. So that's what that does. Either the county appraiser or the Board of Tax Bills. But if we can do it at the county appraiser's level, all the better. Just set it aside. So far, so good. Unfortunately, the bill was not finalized last year, and I'm not sure how this shook out, but speaking to some of my members, I think some of the county appraisers just said, let's do the right thing here and not assess. And we thank them for that, because that was the right thing to do. And moving forward, however, this is still a live issue for the ethanol facilities in the state of Kansas, depending on how PVD writes a guide for the industry going forward, or at least publicly interprets this decision to be applied to the biofuels industry. And if, as we're arguing for, the bulk of that machinery and equipment is properly classified for that industry as personal property, not as fixtures, we could find ourselves in the same situation as we did with the grain industry, depending on when that decision comes out. If they filed for, say, 2024 before March 15th, and then we don't get clarification on that until later in the year, they're going to find ourselves in the same position. And this is a lot of equipment that we're talking about. And 50% of a lot of equipment is going to be a lot of money. So it does matter. So we would, for that reason, it is a live issue for this year. And we'd ask for your support again to move the bill forward. I know there are other stakeholders for other industries that had their position on this bill and support for different reasons. They couldn't be here today. But this wasn't just our industry. It was a handful of others. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a lot of backstory on why we support it. But it's certainly an important issue, an important bill. Would stand for any questions you might have.
Thank you. Randy, refresh my memory. Are the new penalties, the 2%, the 10%, the 12.5, those came from somewhere, didn't they? Does that mirror some other penalties, if I recall correctly, or do you remember?
I don't recall if in the Senate committee they just thought that was something that might be more appropriate when they looked at the types of penalties that were being assessed and how much those were, or if they actually did pull that from another section. It may have been withholding remissions or something like that. If you're late with your tax filing for withholding, that revenue would know more than me, but I don't recall right off.
Yeah, I couldn't remember either, and I might be getting that mistaken or confused with the bill we had on the withholdings pieces as well, because I knew we mirrored maybe the federal language on that piece. But okay, committee, are there any questions for Mr. Stuckey? Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. Randy, we hear this all the time, and what frustrates me a lot here is that you have fellow Kansans at all levels of authority. They do their damnedest to hurt fellow Kansans. You guys hire a lot of people. You buy your stuff with tax dollars. Then you get taxed year after year, whether it's a bass boat or a whatever. I mean, how many years do you think some of this stuff needs to be taxed? I mean, I know people that's got machinery setting in fence lines are still getting taxed on. They probably haven't used it in 5 years. It just seems like a very punitive tax at every level. And I hope someday that we can find a bill just to eliminate this, because it's really all taxes are bad, but this is set up to be a dirty tax and a dirty penalty. Thanks.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
I did leave off. In fact, there's one other change that the county appraisers were in agreement with, and that's that if once you file that rendition, unless there's a change to the list, you don't refile, and that just frees up a lot of time and effort administratively for the taxpayer and the county. So that was another part of the bill that I think everybody agreed with. So
Yeah,
thank you very much.
That was a win-win situation for everybody.
Definitely so.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. And committee, I do want to make mention that Martha Smith's testimony, she was planning on being here. She had a family emergency that she could not be here, but she was really wanting to come in and testify. So please give your attention to her written comments as well. I do not show anyone else wishing to testify. Is there anyone that would like to appear either as a proponent, opponent, or neutral on Senate Bill 8? Seeing none, we will go ahead and close the informational hearing on Senate Bill 8. And I'll turn to our next item of business, which is legislative research. Mr. Penner will give us an update on the interim committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. You should have digitally in front of you a document from our office that is titled Report of the Special Committee on Taxation to the 2024 Kansas Legislature. It's a 6-page report summarizing the work of this year's interim tax committee. And I'm just going to give you an overview of the work of that committee, the study topics that they had and their recommendations. This is something that had been scheduled for earlier in the session, and I had to run to the Senate floor for the tax bill debate to help out some senators then, and so this got pushed off in today's where its landing spot happens to be. And so I'm going to start on the first page of that includes the committee's assigned study topic. One thing that sometimes comes up when we discuss interim committees is that, you all get into session and you've been discussing right out of the gate, single rate, income tax plans, taxation of Social Security, standard deduction, indexing various tax provisions, things like that. And you wonder, well, why did the interim committee not study any of that, since that's what we worked on right out of the gate? Interim committees are assigned a specific study topic by the Legislative Coordinating Council. Now, typically the Legislative Coordinating Council assigns that topic based upon requests that are submitted to them. Any member of the legislature can actually submit an interim request to the Legislative Coordinating Council. And so the study topic for this year's interim tax committee was actually specifically oriented around 4 topics. The first of those was the uniform application of what is termed in the report entity-based sales tax exemptions, including the consideration of a fee-based application for exempt status. By entity-based sales tax exemptions, I mean exemptions that provide for an exemption based upon the entity involved in the sale. This is most specifically the ones where you have a specific nonprofit organization that is deemed to be sales tax exempt by the statute. The next topic was a relatively broad one for the extent of tax credits available in Kansas. The third topic was the process by which local taxing jurisdictions, specifically counties, obtain sales tax authority. You've probably noticed that basically every year it seems like you have 1 or 2 or 3, usually counties who have bills before the legislature asking for special authorization of sales tax authority. And this is designed the topic here was to try to simplify that process. And then the final issue is property valuation issues generally, but most specifically those related to 2023 Senate Concurrent Resolution 1611, which was the proposed constitutional amendment resolution that was adopted by the Senate last year, very late in the sessions. That the House didn't actually have time to closely examine it or take it up, that would have provided for an annual cap on the amount of valuation growth that a property could have under certain circumstances. So those were the 4 topics that the committee had to study, and the LCC gave the committee two whole days for meetings to study those 2 topics. And so kind of the way the committee worked through those topics for the entity-based sales tax exemptions, they kind of initiated or began their work with an idea that the chair had brought to this request. The request that resulted in this committee was a joint request by the chairs of the House and Senate tax committees. And the idea was, it specifically mentions a fee-based application, trying to come up with something that would provide uniformity and a universal application for nonprofits based upon a fee that they pay to receive that exempt status. And so the committee's work on that was primarily presentations by our office and by the Department of Revenue about, first of all, the history of those exemptions and their proliferation in the state. Secondly, what this sort of approach would need to entail, and also including what potential fiscal impacts might be as it relates to this project. With regards to tax credits available in the state, this was somewhat of a carryover item from the previous year's interim tax committee. It's something that year's committee had studied, and so this year, rather than just have a exhaustive inventory of those credits, the committee elected to primarily focus upon getting an update on those credits and specifically new ones that might be available, but also requested the Legislative Division of Post Audit provide information about their evaluations of tax credits and also how the legislature can most effectively equip them or anyone with the ability to effectively evaluate tax credits. One thing that they recommended is when you enact a tax credit, and they recommended this for any tax program, but the study topic was specific to credits, but that you include what your objectives for that tax program are, and that you include the criteria by which you would like to see how effective those objectives have been achieved by the tax legislation. With regards to the process by which local taxing jurisdictions obtain sales tax authority, the committee studied that by presentations by our office and the Department of Revenue on the history of local sales tax, the administrative kind of process by which the department undertakes. The committee also had a couple of counties that recently adopted new local sales taxes, a couple of counties that you recently passed legislation for, come and present about their process. So often you see your process, the bill that you work its way through this process, but you don't always see exactly what the day-to-day is like for those local governments enacting the sales taxes. They wanted to get that perspective. And then they also asked the Kansas Association of Counties and the League of Kansas Municipalities to opine on that topic. And then regarding the property valuation issues, the committee had the Reviser of Statutes office present issues and information related to the constitutional requirements of the property tax in Kansas. Since that resolution was a proposed constitutional amendment, it seemed like the current constitutional lay of the land would probably be a good place to start. They had our office present kind of hypothetical information about how that might impact taxpayers in various counties and in various classes of taxpayer throughout the state. The Property Valuation Division of the Department of Revenue provided detailed information based upon actual tax valuations for specific properties and then for various types of aggregated properties throughout the state. And the Tax Foundation, a representative from there, spoke on the various types of tax limitation regimes that do exist throughout the 50 states. And they spoke specifically about there being levy limitations, assessment limitations, and then revenue limitations, and that this would have been obviously an assessment limitation. Property tax, of course, is an equation. You've got the valuation, you've got the levy, you multiply those two together, and you get the revenue. And any of those three aspects of that equation can be capped or limited or have specific provisions applied to them. And the Tax Foundation gave recommendations regarding what they would advise to be the most effective and the least distortionary of those sorts of policies. And then based upon all of those presentations, the committee discussed and made various recommendations, and that is what you have on the gray box on it's page 03 of the report. I think it's actually might just be the second page with actual text on it in front of you. And so I'll now walk through those conclusions and recommendations, specifically by which of these study topics they were associated with. First, regarding the fee-based application for exempt status for sales tax, the committee made one recommendation, and that is that the legislature continue to evaluate ways to improve the uniformity of the application of sales tax exemptions for entities, specifically nonprofit entities throughout the state. They did recommend that the legislature consider legislation that would just provide a blanket exemption for entities exempt pursuant to Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And that was to consider a blanket exemption, not a blanket exemption with a fee-based system applied. For the second, or it's not actually listed second, but for the study topic of the process for local taxing jurisdictions, the committee made one recommendation, and that is to introduce legislation and consider it to simplify the process for local sales tax adoption. And they recommended that the emphasis be placed upon the control of the local voters who are actually voting for or against the sales tax provision. Part of that is that the committee recommended considering making the tax limits uniform for cities and counties. Currently in our sales tax statutes, counties have one set of limits and cities have a separate set of limits, and they're not exactly the same. Cities, generally speaking, have more sales tax authority than counties, which is why it's primarily, and I actually believe almost exclusively, maybe exclusively, counties that come before the legislature asking for additional authority. Of course, there's another aspect of that they worked their way through. They didn't have a specific recommendation regarding, and that is the fact that countywide sales taxes in Kansas are generally apportioned across the cities and the counties, with the cities and the county, the cities within the county. And that is kind of an additional issue that might need to be resolved, because sometimes the legislation that comes before you isn't really seeking additional authority. It's rather seeking the opportunity to have the sales tax revenue be dedicated to a specific project rather than apportioned across all of the municipalities within the county. For the bullet point of the extent of tax credits available in Kansas, the committee had 4 recommendations, and those are the 3rd through 7th bullet points in the gray box. The first of those is to consider a procedure to require effectiveness evaluation criteria to be included in any current tax preference statutes and all new tax preference legislation. The second is one that was only tangentially related to this, but it came up in the context of it. So for discussion purposes, I lumped it into it. And that is that the legislature consider requiring, either by rule of the legislature or by statute, that any legislation providing for tax credits or tax preferences of any kind actually has to come to a tax committee. One of the things that came up during the interim committee was that some of the new tax legislation that was presented by the Legislative Division of Post Audit was enacted via legislation that moved through other committees on both sides of the legislature. I believe that some of it moved through Federal and State Affairs Committee on the Senate side, and maybe I believe the Rural Development Committee on the House side. And there was a concern among some of the members of the committee that the tax committees were largely unaware of that legislation, at least its detailed workings, and so they requested the legislature consider a requirement that tax legislation come to the tax committees. A third recommendation, and this is one that was part of the previous year's report, and that is that the legislature should consider repealing tax credits and tax provisions that have not been used in recent years. We do have a number of those on the books, and obviously the number of those is larger or smaller depending upon your exact definition of recent years. And then finally, the last recommendation on that topic was once again just kind of tangentially related to it, and that is that the legislature should evaluate the transparency and taxpayer confidentiality requirements to ensure that you all are able to effectively evaluate tax credits. Kansas, of course, has provisions in its statutes providing for confidentiality of taxpayers' tax information. I think that's something that everybody thinks is good and appropriate, but you also have a challenge that sometimes generates in terms of, do those taxpayer confidentiality provisions that you have provided for in statute stand as an impediment for you in evaluating your tax legislation? And so the committee just wanted you all to consider that issue and think about, are there steps you can take to better enable yourselves to evaluate tax legislation without compromising taxpayer confidentiality. And so that moves to the last issue, the property valuation issues. The committee had 2 recommendations on that. The first was to consider various versions of property tax assessment limitations. They requested especially a consideration of a possible hybrid of the version contained in SCR 1611 and the approach that is used by the state of Florida that they did specifically receive information on. They also recommended that the legislature consider bifurcating the property tax limitation benefits to residential property versus all other property, that maybe there is a greater consideration that needs to be given to residential property for those sort of tax valuation growth issues. And finally, they did recommend that the legislature not solely focus its work on property taxes on the issue of valuation growth, and that it rather consider the entirety of that property tax calculation, both the valuation issue, but also the mill levy component of property tax burdens, including kind of all approaches that might result in that mill levy component being reduced, the school finance mill levy, possibly the local ad valorem tax reduction fund, and possibly some sort of tax levy limitations, which Kansas, over the long course of statehood, has an expansive history of, but have largely been removed from the property tax code as it exists today. And with that, I would stand for whatever questions this committee might have about that committee's work.
Thank you, Eddie. You did a great job of summarizing 2 days worth of data and information. And committee, those meetings are still out. If you're late at night trying to get to sleep, you can turn those on and listen. If you want to dig into some of the topics, there were some really good presentations, really good information and discussion on each one of those items. But I would encourage you, if you want to, take a look at the recordings and the archives of those meetings. But for now, are there any questions for Mr. Penner? Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you ever seen a preliminary fiscal note on the exemption of the 501c3s from the sales tax code?
I believe that the Department of Revenue gave a preliminary number to the interim committee, and I don't have that here in front of me today, but I can track down what was provided and the exact parameters that went into that estimate and provide that. Because obviously the issue there is when you say give a sales tax exemption, it is what you mean by sales tax exemption. Do you just mean purchases by them? Do you mean by or on behalf of? Do you mean to include project exemption certificates? Do you mean to include their sales? And so there's a lot of different small levers that, if they're all going in the same direction, can cause the impact there to change dramatically one way or the other.
Yeah, I just know sometimes I have a really great tax idea and then I see the fiscal note and it floors me. So,
sure.
Thanks.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, you've done an excellent job explaining everything, and there are quite a few of these that we will be seeing this session in bill format, and as we try to work through those. As Representative Francis said, with each one, once you dive into them a little bit more, each issue has its own little perks and interesting pieces to it that requires more thought and discussion. But we will hopefully have some legislation to take a look at and then analyze and work from there. But if there are no further questions, thank you, Eddie. And we will try to get that initial fiscal note that was presented in committee, but then once the bill is introduced, we'll have a little bit clearer idea of what that is. Committee, that does conclude our work for the day. I did want to return to, was there any other bill requests? I thought there was a few hanging out there, but that may not be ready yet. So, okay, well, if that is all, we are adjourned.